Hello, everyone, and welcome to Context. This program is brought to you by the Idaho Humanities Council with funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. The views expressed here today do not necessarily represent those of the IHC or the NEH. My name is Joanna Bringhurst, and joining us today is Dr. Nick Underwood, a historian of modern Jewish and modern European history from the College of Idaho. Dr. Underwood has taught courses on modern Jewish, European, and world history at Sonoma State University, University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and Napa Valley College. He has held postdoctoral fellowships at the GHI Pacific Regional Office at the University of California, Berkeley, and the Frankel Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. He also serves as managing editor for the journal American Jewish History and as project manager for the Digital Yiddish Theater Project. Nick, thank you for joining me here today to discuss Jewish history. Many Idahoans have learned about the tragic history of the Holocaust, but do not know much about the full history of the Jewish people. There are thousands of years of rich history to study, and we have limited time together. So can you help us understand the essentials and where we can begin learning?
So Joanna, first of all, I'd like to thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a thrill to participate in this project and with the IHC. Big supporter of the work that you're doing, and again, just appreciate the invitation. Yes, so thousands of years of Jewish history in 30 minutes. I think we can do it, right? And I think you're right too. One of the things that hopefully will kind of come out of this conversation is that I think a lot of people, when they have any experience or understanding about Jewish history, it's either tied to kind of two moments, right? The Holocaust or kind of biblical history, right? And I think what happens in between and after, especially after the Holocaust, is one of the things hopefully will come out of this conversation to kind of really kind of deepen our understanding of a really varied global kind of experience for Jews, right? And I think that hopefully that'll kind of come through in this conversation.
Thank you. I'm excited to learn more for myself and for our listeners as well.
Absolutely. So I think, one of the things we can do is I think it's important to understand kind of the way that kind of Jewish history has transformed. And one of the things I will do today is I'm a historian, so a lot of, obviously, when we're talking about Israelites, when we're talking about Jews, we're talking about a religious community. I will focus less on the kind of like the theology and more really kind of on the history. So we'll be thinking about kind of patterns and migration, and we'll talk about language and kind of where Jews have found themselves throughout time, and for some of the reasons for that. If you think that's an okay approach for today.
That sounds perfect.
Great. One of the things that I think it's important to understand is, kind of Jewish history has changed a lot. And one of the major kind of turning points was, so if anyone is familiar with the Bible and we're kind of understand the story of kind of like the five books of Moses and the Hebrew Bible, or the Tanakh as it's known by its Hebrew acronym, we know that there is a period in Jewish history when it is temple-based, right? There's a temple in Jerusalem, and kind of Jewish society, life, and culture is centered on this temple. This is an extraordinarily important part of Jewish history, and if anyone is familiar with the book of Leviticus, knows that all the rules kind of put into how one walks into a temple. This is kind of set up for this particular moment in Jewish history. Unfortunately, there are two temples that exist, and the second temple is destroyed in 70 CE. And by CE, in Jewish history, use BCE and CE, so the before the Common Era and Common Era, sometimes also called BC or AD. So when I say CE, I'm referring to kind of AD. In 70 CE, the Romans destroy the Second Temple, and this kind of fundamentally changes Jewish history. It goes from a community, a religion, a nationality, if you will, that is based on the temple, and we kind of move away from the priests kind of having authority within Judaism and Jewish culture and move to what people refer to as the rise of the rabbis. Once the temple is destroyed, we start to see kind of dispersion of Jews around the world in certain places, and we'll talk about some of that in a little bit. And what we start to see when we talk about the rise of the rabbis, so I've mentioned the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, the Torah, the five books of Moses, which is part of that. We start to see the development of what's called the Talmud. And the Talmud is a compendium of the Mishnah, which is the writing down of the oral Torah. During the period of the Bible, there was an oral component to the Torah that was circulated. That is written down. And then there's some kind of compendium to that called the Gemara, which is kind of a way to try to understand, to some extent, the Mishnah. And over hundreds of years, rabbis debate and kind of think about and put together the Talmud. There's two Talmuds. There is one that is finished first in Jerusalem. It's sometimes referred to as either the Jerusalem Talmud or the Palestinian Talmud. Both terms are used. And then also there's the Babylonian Talmud, and that is the more authoritative one. That is finished in around 550 CE. It takes hundreds of years to put together. The Talmud is an attempt to with the fall of the temple, with Jews now in diaspora spread all over the world, how do we understand Jewish law? How do we kind of follow Jewish law? The Talmud is there to try and kind of create what in Hebrew, halakha, or Jewish law, right? And that's what the Talmud tries to do. So this is why we think of 70 CE as a turning point, right? The temple is destroyed. And then we start to see kind of new figures in Judaism kind of rise as being kind of authoritative, and it's the rabbis and the rabbinic order really that kind of create and establish this Talmud, and in these years of diaspora become one of the two major books that kind of Jews kind of utilize in their daily lives, the Bible, of course, and the Talmud.
Great. Can I ask you, when most people think of Jews, they think of their religious identity, but you talked about an ethnicity and a race beyond.
Yes.
Just a belief system. Can you explain more?
Yeah, in the classes that I teach, one of the questions I always pose to students is, what does it mean to be Jewish, right? And I think that that's one of the things that changes over time. Clearly, when we're talking about ancient Judaism, when we're talking about the temple period, this is everything, right? I think that it's interesting sometimes to think about religion as almost a modern construct, right? I mean, if you were thinking about ancient times, if we're thinking about even the years 500 CE, religion, culture, society, all these things are intertwined with one another, right? It's we see kind of over time the separation of some of these, and we kind of see we'll start to see as we move into more of the modern period, people who are Jewish, who identify as Jewish, but not religious at all, right? And that changes over time. Depends on who you are and where you are, like how you answer those questions. But yes, there is a time when Jewishness is really kind of confined to Judaism, and how Judaism is kind of an overarching kind of component of life. But as Jews leave their ancient homelands and go to other places, their interaction with religion, their interactions with other societies change, and they're almost always in kind of constant discussion with those greater societies. I'm not sure if that's a satisfying answer, but yes, it's complicated.
Of course. And do all rabbis agree with each other on how to understand the Talmud and the Bible, or is there a range of thinking?
There is a range of thinking, and one of the things that I think is beautiful about kind of the Talmud, especially so the way that it's printed, there's originally the Babylonian Talmud that's printed, and then over into the Middle Ages, what winds up happening is that there are later versions of the Talmud that are actually printed with later rabbinic commentary. There is a famous rabbi, his name is Rashi. He lives in medieval France, and he becomes one of the most prolific commentators on both the Torah, on the Bible, and also the Talmud. So there are later printings of the Talmud that have Rashi's and some other people's commentaries on it. And one of the beautiful things about it is you'll see them completely disagreeing with each other. They're debating. I think sometimes the most Jewish approach to texts is that they're in constant debate with those texts. And what does that mean? Why this word? How is this word used here in this section? Whereas maybe in the book of Numbers, that Hebrew is used in, that word is used differently here. And then maybe later, it's used differently. How do we understand the use of these words? So the rabbis over time still today, our debate on how to understand the Mishnah and the Gemara, and of course also the Bible. So
Thank you.
yes.
Thank you. So then after this time period, Jews began to spread out across Europe, across the Middle East. What did that look like?
Yeah, so first, after kind of leaving or kind of dispersion, up until it's one of the things that I think is eye-opening to many people is that between the 7th and the 13th centuries, 90% of global Jewry lived in Islamic societies, mostly in around the Mediterranean, and also up into the Iberian Peninsula, which until 1492 was primarily controlled by Islamic empires. So I think, so primarily the initial migrations are in and around the Mediterranean. And like I said, from the 7th to about the 13th century, the majority of global Jewry live in those lands. It's really kind of after 1492, which is with first the Inquisition and the expulsion of Jews from the Iberian Peninsula by Ferdinand and Isabella, that we start to see kind of like movement into other parts of the world. But it's an important thing to understand that first kind of the migration is kind of regional to some extent, and then we start to see kind of Jews like expand out to other places around the world.
When did Jews first come to America, North and South America?
So, yes. So the first, so I'll first say this. So Jews start to move into Europe mainly around the year 1000, but in very small numbers in the Rhineland and the western part of Germany. Into the Americas, it happens after the expulsion, and it happens as a result of the expulsion. So the first Jewish communities in the Americas that we see are in a port town in the northern part of Brazil called Recife, around just shortly after the year 1500. And then it's from there that we start to see the first kind of arrivals of Jews in what we now refer to as North America, in the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam. And it's about 1654 that there's actually recent history that's actually kind of uncovered that this is probably the first established community that comes to North America. There apparently are a few other Jews that come to this area, but they don't stay, they leave. But we still refer to as this community from Recife that comes to New Amsterdam as the first kind of Jewish community in North America.
Wow, I did not realize it was so early. I think we always think of the Puritans.
Yes.
Settling here, that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I also should note too that and I apologize for not mentioning this earlier, is when we start to see these diasporas from kind of ancient homelands, we start to see kind of also different communities of Jews emerge, right? So when we're talking about the Jews being displaced from the Iberian Peninsula, we're talking about a group of Jews who are known as Sephardim, which comes from the old biblical term for what is known as the Iberian Peninsula, called Sepharad. So when we're talking about the Jews that come to the Americas first, those are Sephardic Jews who are establishing themselves in Recife and then in New Amsterdam. The other communities of Jews are Ashkenazi Jews, who are Jews that originate from Central Europe, Ashkenaz, and also a category of Arab Jews, who we probably won't talk about very much today because we only have a limited amount of time, but Mizrahi Jews too, so are kind of mostly Jews of Arab descent to some extent. So when we're talking about global Jewry, we're talking about different communities. Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews sometimes have different practices in how they interpret certain holidays and whatnot. Use the same books, right? I mean, Bible, Talmud, but sometimes even there's different traditions within those communities.
How were Jews received by those communities, and what was life like for them?
It depends. The community in Recife is stable there for a number of years. The reason they move is because the government there is starting to kind of put more restrictions on kind of mobility, practice. So, there's some stability there, but they move. That's why they moved to New Amsterdam, and there's even kind of issues there with the governor of New Amsterdam at the time. In the Islamic lands, for a good number of years, the relationship between Jews and their larger host societies is relatively stable. There's in fact a good 100 to 200 years around the 7th to 9th century that some people refer to as the golden age for Jewry in the Islamic lands. Lots of cultural production, lots of philosophical, religious kind of production too, a real kind of really almost kind of conversation too with Islamic society. There's debates during this period as to whether or not Hebrew should adopt an Arabic kind of meter to it in terms of prose and literature. So there's lots of kind of moments of stability, upward mobility to some extent within these largely prescriptive societies. We also see the same thing at times in the European lands too. So as you know, again, most people are familiar with the Holocaust. We know of the tragic events of those moments, but before that, where Jews are finding themselves, they're experiencing moments of autonomy in some cases, sometimes cultural kind of religious flourishing. You know, the Talmud is developed in an area that will ultimately become part of the Islamic empires, especially after the ascension of Muhammad and the development of Islam. So we see kind of some major things happening when Jews are kind of within these societies. We also do know that at moments there are moments of persecution in all of these places that we're seeing, whether it's a new caliphate that kind of has different restrictions than their predecessor, whether it's the colonial authorities in South America that are putting on new restrictions, whether it's you know, people in the European lands encountering Jews and thinking them as enemies of the faith during the Crusades. So we have a bunch of moments of kind of both hostilities and also kind of prosperity, or I don't know, maybe prosperity is not the right word, but stability.
So then in the 19th century, things started to change with the rise of Yiddish culture. Can you help us understand what does Yiddish mean, and why was this a successful change?
Yeah, so the rise of Yiddish it's one thing that I think about a lot. My own personal research deals with Yiddish, specifically in France. So I think about the rise of Yiddish culture, and hopefully also this will kind of dovetail into a conversation about Ladino culture, which is another kind of language that emerges. One thing I should say actually before I talk about Yiddish is, you know, one of the things that's really fascinating and interesting about kind of the Jewish diaspora is that whenever Jews are kind of encountering these societies like we were just talking about, they're developing sometimes their own versions of those languages. And there are on record dozens of Judeo languages, which are typically like languages that are based on the major language, but written in the Hebrew script and sometimes involving Hebrew components into that language. So, for instance, there's Judeo-Arabic, which is written from Jews in the Islamic empires. That would be Arabic written in Hebrew characters, and it would be a version of Arabic that might include Hebraisms for kind of daily life, right? Yiddish begins as Judeo-German, right? It's a version of High Middle German that is established around or emerges around the year 1000. And it's a version of German that is written in the Hebrew script. And then as Jews kind of move around, as Jews from Central Europe are kind of expelled and kind of end up in Eastern Europe, Yiddish develops a large kind of Slavic component to it also. It also has this Hebrew component, mostly for kind of religious purposes. Others as well, but a good portion of the Hebrew used in Yiddish refers to kind of religious components. So that's all to say that there's a really wide, vast, varied kind of Jewish linguistic history that goes along with this diaspora. The Sephardic Jews develop it's debated as to how we can refer to it, but I think simply there's a Judeo-Spanish or Judeo-Espanol, which is also sometimes referred to as Ladino, and Sephardic Jews, especially in places like Izmir and Salonika, really kind of develop a flourishing kind of Ladino culture as well. So whenever Jews kind of are moving around, they're adopting languages, and there are scholars working on these Jewish languages, and they're finding that there are dozens and dozens of them that have emerged around the world at different periods of time. But back to Yiddish. So I mentioned that Yiddish is a language that kind of emerges around the year 1000, and it's used widely by a number of Jews in Eastern Europe. After Jews are kind of like moved from Central Europe into Eastern Europe, it's used by a number of them. It is kind of part of the Jewish Enlightenment that happens around the same time as the European Enlightenment. It's also a language used primarily by Hasidic Jews as they're kind of establishing themselves around the 18th and 19th centuries. And it's also it's also the language that in the 19th century will wind up being used by Yiddish-speaking Eastern European Jews who are trying to figure out how to establish kind of new national identities, right? This is the 19th century is a period when Europe is experimenting and figuring out how to identify itself in the wake of empire, in the wake of the fall of the kings and the queens, these new national identities, and Jews are doing the same thing, right? And Yiddish is kind of part of this, where in the 19th century, it's an effort to kind of create this literature, kind of really kind of create this world just beyond the daily vernacular, kind of within Yiddish, and we start to see a rise of secular Yiddish culture that really kind of has this guise of like national identity embedded into it. And it's a really remarkable project that happens. It's mostly in the late 19th century. We see a number of writers kind of switched from maybe writing in Hebrew, maybe writing in Russian, to writing in Yiddish. And from that, we get some of the most well-known Jewish stories, most notably from a writer named Shalom Aleichem, who writes a number of stories based on a milk carrier named Tevye. He will write a number of short stories based on him, and it's actually those short stories that wind up being turned into the Broadway musical Fiddler on the Roof. So we have a wide kind of flourishing Yiddish culture that is really kind of happening in the late 19th century and carrying on into the early 20th century. And in Eastern Europe, we're talking about millions of Yiddish speakers at this period too, which if you think about it on a very basic level, makes sense as to why Jews would want to start to create in this language, because this is the language that people are actually using, right? This is how people are communicating, so perhaps we can elevate this to some sort of different kind of stature.
So Jews in Europe at this time are talking to each other in Yiddish every day, and then starting to write and create fiction and explore their culture using the Yiddish language. This is so fascinating to me, and I'm curious, did the rise of Yiddish culture come because Jews wanted to be a part of the communities where they had settled, but also retain their Jewishness, or how would you view that?
So I think it's important to understand the context that this is happening in, right? When we think of Eastern Europe, we're talking about Europe, but we're not really talking about Central or Western Europe, right? When we think of Central Europe, we think of German-speaking lands, right? These are mostly monolingual spaces. It's not entirely true, but generally speaking, a form of German, like Yiddish once was, right? Western Europe also, people are speaking in vast lands, maybe Spanish, some places I know also Basque, of course, and some of the Pyrenees and the Basque lands there, but primarily Spanish, maybe French, right? So we have Eastern Europe is a different space, and it's multilingual, right? And it's also a place that develops in terms of kind of like nation states very differently, right? The way that Eastern Europe is constructed and through really World War I is a very different place than the rest in Central and Western Europe. So, and I say that only to say that these are multilingual, multinational kind of empires, And so yes, to answer your question, that is what's happening, right? We can develop these cultures, we can develop this identity that is an attempt to kind of maintain some sort of Jewishness that might work in this framework. Maybe it's a linguistic kind of national understanding, but yet still part of these larger societies.
That is really interesting because you're right. When we think of Europe today, it's nation states, clearly defined borders, languages.
Mm-hmm.
But Eastern Europe was so different at that time. All of Europe was.
Mm-hmm.
In the early 20th century,
Mm-hmm.
conflict and other factors caused a lot of migrations
Mm-hmm.
around the globe.
Yes.
What was happening to Jewish communities in Europe at that time?
So John, it's a great question, and I'll I want to go back to one thing that I said before too, is that so Yiddish is not only it's function in exactly the space that you're talking about. Yiddish is also the language. So when the Russian Empire absorbs or takes a majority of Poland, they mark off what's called the Pale of Settlement, and it's an area restricted. It's not only Jews, but Jews are restricted to this area. So it's also, there's a few things that are happening here. So the Yiddish is happening in the exact context, but it's also happening in this space where Jews are restricted to, and the Pale of Settlement is in place until the early 20th century. So it's also, there's this other element too, that where kind of like Yiddish is forming in a time and a place where Jews are restricted. They're facing kind of limits on where they can go and move. So it's also a way for Jews to kind of connect with themselves. So it's simultaneously informed by kind of like the larger forces at play in Eastern Europe. Excuse me, but also kind of from the particular Jewish experience, which is that Jews in Eastern Europe are living in the Pale of Settlement. And the Pale of Settlement covers a vast majority of the Eastern Europe that we would be that we're familiar with. Places that we're talking about today, Kyiv, Warsaw, all these, Poland. What now we think of as Poland and Ukraine, Belarus. That was the kind of original, like that was the area of the Pale of Settlement. So yes. So Joanna, So excuse me. So turn of the century, what winds up happening is we start to see kind of conflict, also a rise of a lot of different ideologies. The 19th century, right, is kind of like when capitalism starts to flourish, and socialism and communism and all these isms that, you know, in at least in when I teach our civilization course, you know, this is the 19th century is the century of isms, right? Everything is popping up, Romanticism, and Jews are kind of also kind of attaching themselves to some of these movements. Sometimes they see themselves as way to kind of ways to get out of some of their conditions. Some of them, and they see them as liberatory in a variety of ways. But the conflicts that happen in the turn of the century do wind up affecting Jews. We start to see Jews involved in revolutionary movements as early as 1905. We also start to see with that violence. We start to see pogroms kind of emerge, right? So as earlier than this, but still kind of definitely after 1881, we start to see pogroms in Eastern Europe. A pogrom is a word used that comes from a Slavic word that can mean a lot of things, but typically within the Jewish experience, it means kind of a targeted violence against a Jewish community. And a pogrom could be 5 to hundreds or thousands of Jews kind of being attacked. So that's what I mean by the word pogrom. So with the turn of the century, we start to see these rise of pogroms, and it really kind of affects how Jews start to think about themselves, how they start to kind of think about ways of organizing themselves. It should be you know, when we start to think about the rise of Yiddish and the rise of like this particular kind of Eastern European Jewish national, however we want to understand it, identity, it's at the same moment that we start to see Zionism and modern Hebrew kind of be established as another potential kind of Jewish national identity too. So the conflicts, the violence, the disruption that is happening in Eastern Europe in the late and early 20th century, even before we get to World War I, is really kind of affecting Jews and how they're understanding their places in society.
So can you explain Zionism to us and how it was perceived and what it originally was meant?
Sure. So we see Zionism emerge in the late 19th century. There are, as I mentioned, there is a rise in kind of anti-Semitic attacks by way of these pogroms, but we also start to see primarily not primarily in France, we have an affair called the Dreyfus Affair, which is Alfred Dreyfus is a high-ranking military official in the French army, and he is brought up for treason because he is suspected of stealing, giving secrets to the Germans, secret military secrets. It winds up being a large affair, and essentially he is accused because he's suspect for being Jewish. And for a number of people, this is a defining moment. Typically, the story goes that Theodor Herzl, who is a Viennese journalist and writer, is in Paris at this time, responds to or is writing about the Dreyfus Affair, and comes up with this idea of creating a Jewish national homeland. We know now that actually he developed some of these ideas prior, but the Dreyfus Affair is definitely still a linchpin in kind of the understanding of the development of Zionism. And Zionism is a movement that sought to establish a autonomous political homeland, and I'm actually going to split that up a little bit, for Jews. I say political because I mentioned Theodor Herzl, who is sometimes called the father of political Zionism. But in the earlier 20th century, there's a variety of Zionisms, right? There's a cultural Zionism that is put forth by a person named Ahad Ha'am, who really thinks that it should be a Hebrew culture that drives people to a particular place, and there's more of a grassroots way of kind of establishing a national home. Herzl thinks that it ought to be done by way of kind of international diplomacy. So there's a variety of Zionisms that happen and emerge in the early 20th century. Originally, it was not always thought that Palestine would be the place that this national homeland would emerge. There's many people who were thinking of places around the world, La Pampas in Argentina, the so-called the Uganda plan, and kind of in West Africa. There's a number of Zionists too that think that there should be that the homeland should be placed in Eastern Africa. There's research right now going on that there was actually in Baja California, or in Baja, an attempt, kind of coordination. There's some grad students who are working on this right now, that there were a number of inquiries around the world about where this potential homeland could be. After 1905, with a pogrom in Kishinev, the International Zionist Organization, the Congress, that is when they kind of start focusing more on what they would call Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, or Palestine, as it would have been called then under the Ottoman Empire. And even kind of dating to the Roman Empire. So Zionism is this varied attempt, through different routes about how to find a Jewish national homeland somewhere, which is in opposition to some extent what the people who were advocating for Yiddish were doing, because the Yiddish speakers thought that they could create that national autonomy in the places where they saw themselves. Of course, that's not true of all Yiddish speakers, but if we're thinking big picture about kind of how these national identities are evolving and how they're emerging, they have different kind of they have rootedness understood differently.
Okay, so
I'm not sure if that's helpful or not.
So as the 20th century is progressing, there isn't one unified idea among Jewish people of what Zionism means, or where should be a homeland, or even what that looks like. But most are living and speaking different languages and different nationalities, but Yiddish culture kind of unites them across those borders. Is that fair?
For Yiddish speakers.
For Yiddish speakers,
Yes.
right.
I mean...
But in Spain...
In Spain, Ladino speakers and speakers who are speaking various languages, their approaches to this are going to be very different, right? Ladino speakers in the Ottoman Empire in the early stages are not supportive of some of the, or this is, of course, I'm speaking very generally here. Generally speaking, not supportive of the Zionist movement, because they have some stability within the Ottoman Empire, right? We're talking about Jews in Europe that are experiencing violence and instability, and kind of creating some of these ideals and ideas around that, right? So, Joanna, it's actually, if we go back to our earlier conversation about the Talmud and how rabbis are constantly debating how to understand the Mishnah, Gemara, and also the Bible. That could be extended to the conversation we're having now, which is that Jews around the world are not in kind of agreement, right? There's lots of different approaches and debates and arguments about how these kind of issues ought to be solved. So even among the Yiddish speakers, there's debate, right? Is it do we kind of adhere to Republican societies, right? Like places like France. Is that where we can create this Yiddish cultural world for us? Is it adherence to socialism or communism, right? Is it like, an abandoning of these types of frameworks that are kind of seen in some of these states? So even within the Yiddish communities and Zionist communities too, there's debates about how this should work, how this looks like. So it only complicates. I'm only complicating the picture further, unfortunately, and not making it simpler, because there is agreement among some groups, but there are many groups that are in disagreement with each other.
History is complicated.
It's, my students hate it when they ask me a question, I say, it's complicated.
I can relate. So in the 20th century now, we have World War I. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of change in Europe, instability, famine, depression, leads to a lot of migration, which all sets the stage for the Holocaust. What do we need to understand to be able to put into context the Holocaust in the greater story of the Jewish people?
I think, Joanna, the way that you set it up is a really nice way to do that, right? This is a moment of instability, not just for Jews, but for Europeans, right? In the wake of World War I. So one thing that happens, and we should kind of talk about this a little bit, is that, when we mentioned the Dreyfus Affair. The Dreyfus Affair is a turning point in kind of thinking about Jews in society, right? Many scholars and historians think of, like, prior to the Dreyfus Affair, when we think of anti-Semitism, we're thinking about anti-Judaism, right? It's targeted violence sometimes against Jews because of the practices that they're doing as primarily not Christian, right? Most pogroms, most kind of anti-Jewish violence happens in Christian-dominated lands like Europe, right? And there's historical reasons for that. It does happen in the Islamic lands, but not as common. So with the Dreyfus Affair, though, what we start to see is this shift away from anti-Judaism to something that is really kind of embedded into the racial theories that are emerging in Europe in the late 19th century, and we start to see a racialization of Jews, right? And so it's important to understand that because it helps contextualize how and why in the early 20th century this so-called Jewish question emerges so broadly and is confounding for people because of how non-Jews are starting to imagine Jews in racial categories and assigning them kind of inherent or essentialized qualities that they think are disrupting their particular societies, right? So it's important to understand that, especially if we think about Hitler's anti-Semitism. It is a very racialized anti-Semitism. So it's important to understand that this kind of along with this instability kind of socially and culturally and politically that's happening in Europe at this time, we're also seeing this rise of this kind of racialized anti-Semitism that is feeding into these changes. And it's not just in Europe that these anti-Semitisms, this racialized anti-Semitism are spreading, but to kind of keep us on track a little bit, we'll kind of focus on the European case here. But so that's what's happening. And we start to see kind of Jews being kind of scapegoated, really, kind of for all the ills of society, right? Whether it's the rise, the anti-Semitic tropes that exist, that Jews kind of control money and are money lenders, and kind of therefore kind of control global finance. In the early 20th century, there was a famous banking family, the Rothschilds, who were both based in France. That was a code among anti-Semites for kind of targeting Jews as kind of being in charge of global finance. There's contemporary parallels today, but historically speaking, the Rothschilds were part of that. Alongside that, though, too, Jews are kind of blamed for Bolshevism, communism, right? So they're kind of like attached to these elements in society that people are threatened by, right? And so kind of we start to see, this is where this racialized component comes in, right? Where like there's this kind of people, anti-Semites, start to think that there's something essentialized about these Jews that kind of make them have a propensity towards towards these movements, right? And it has to do with othering, scapegoating. How do we blame the ill? How do we simply blame or place blame or understand the root causes for our societies? And in the European case, primarily what happens in the early 20th century is that Jews start to be targeted. They were, of course, like I mentioned before, targeted before, but we start to see this uptick in kind of these moments of anti-Semitism fed through this lens of kind of a racialized understanding of them at this particular moment.
Okay, so Hitler, in seeking power in Germany, lies about Jews to have a scapegoat, a convenient scapegoat, as to why the German economy is in shambles, why German people feel that they are not receiving their proper place in the global order of things. I think it's really important when we talk about like othering and scapegoating to be really clear that this was not true. These were lies.
Yes.
And Hitler sought to manipulate German people to gain power by lying about blaming Jewish people for the troubles in their country.
Yes, and I think, Joanna, it's a good point to make about all of these kind of stereotypes, that they're not rooted in truth, right? We'll step back for a second to kind of even flesh that out even more. There is an anti-Semitic myth that develops called the blood libel, which is that Jews kidnap a Christian child, murder that child, and use that blood as an ingredient in matzah for Passover. I have seen a number of recipes for matzah over the years, and I've never seen one ever that includes even a teeny tiny drop of blood, right?
Oh,
so,
no,
never,
okay.
never seen it. So yes, to your point.
So we can rule that out.
Yes, roll that out. So the point, I mean, just to further your point, that these ideas are based on kind of fear and scapegoating and an attempt to very simply blame someone for larger societal lives. And in the case of Europe, when we're talking about a small population, right? Usually these Jewish communities in these places are 1%, 3%, very small. It's easy to blame a minority for society's ills, right? So yes, they're all completely fabricated. They're not. There's no truth to kind of a world, a group of Jewish cabal that's controlling all of global finances. Many people in the early 20th century thought the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is a fabricated book by the Russian Empire that is supposedly a secret meeting of Jews that are trying to meet to control global finance, completely fabricated. If we look back at Jewish history, especially in these places, Jews in Germany had some upward mobility, and there was a large German Jewish middle class. Same thing in France, especially by the late 19th and early 20th century. But if we think about like Jews broadly conceived in Europe, we're talking about a fairly impoverished population. We're not talking about a wealthy population. Yes, we mentioned a couple wealthy families, but again, just to kind of prove or to further your point that a lot of this is just fabricated. I think you're right. They're lies. I think the word you used is perfect. And they're not really kind of they're rooted in an attempt to kind of create an explanation for the ills of society than they are rooted in any actual truth.
Absolutely. So Hitler escalates his anti-Semitic beliefs and views after the Nazi Party takes total control of the German government and begins a systematic campaign of exterminating Jews from Germany. And as Germany expands its borders through invading other nations to exterminate Jews in those nations as well. The Holocaust is very widely known. We've all learned about it in school, read books, seen movies. But what happened after the Holocaust? Because I will be honest, when I was growing up learning about the Holocaust, the story the narrative that I intuited was, but the war ended and the Allies beat Hitler and it's all okay from there. But the first time that I traveled to Europe, I really learned for myself how successful Hitler and his regime was in really murdering millions of people, and they were largely successful in that goal. But not totally successful. What happens to the Jewish people after the Holocaust? How do survivors rebuild? Where do they go? Walk us through it.
So, Joanne, just like everything, it's complicated. And one thing I'll say too is, when we were talking about Yiddish culture before, that is the culture that is murdered by the Nazis, right? Most of the mass killing happens in Eastern Europe, right? Germany has a very small Jewish population. So, it's when Germany kind of enters the Eastern Europe after the outbreak of war in September 1939, that Hitler encounters and has these kind of Jews within their land. So it's an important thing to remember that mass murder happened in Eastern Europe, right?
So you mean Poland, Ukraine,
yes,
Belarus,
yes,
the former Yugoslavia?
Yes, those places, right? If you map where the 5 main killing centers are, the Operation Reinhardt and others, those are in Eastern Europe, right? There are concentration camps all over, right? There's tens of thousands of concentration camps. Colleagues at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum are uncovering that there's estimates, I think it's now like 55,000 concentration camps all over Europe. But in terms of like mass killing, that's really happening in Eastern Europe, both by way of these camps, by these extermination centers, but also by way of some people refer to it as the Holocaust by bullets, the murdering of millions of Jews just by armed people on the front lines. So that's all to say that this is kind of, to kind of tie back to the Yiddish cultural component of it, right? Is that we do see Yiddish culture come back, but it's slow because of that is who the target was. After the war, it's a complicated story for many people. It's Jews who are liberated. There are choices, but there are fewer choices. The ways to get out of Europe or stay in Europe are difficult. There winds up being a series of displacement persons camps that are established in the early wake of the war. Some of them remain open until the 1950s, and they're an attempt to try and rehome these Jews, right? Some cases it's where they originally came from. Some places we see Jews going to places such as South Africa, Argentina, There's a number that try to make their way through Brazil and Uruguay. Also, Jews go to places like Mexico, and then, of course, a number of Holocaust survivors come to the United States and dramatically kind of transform the American Jewish population. If we think about the Holocaust, one thing that it does, and we kind of talked about kind of Jews migrating, and we talked about Jews going to South Africa in the wake of the expulsion from the Iberian Peninsula. We talked about Jews in the Islamic lands and how that changes. The Holocaust really is another moment of transformation of global Jewish population, where the centers of Jewish life are no longer in Europe. They will now wind up being in other places. And after May of 1948 and the establishment of the State of Israel, we'll over time see Israel, the United States, and then by the mid-50s, early 60s, France will end up being the third largest Jewish population in the world. So the Holocaust does kind of cause a major transformation of where Jews are because of murder and also because of the migration that happens as a result of that. So their attempts to establish themselves happen in a variety of ways. Like I mentioned, there's camps. People are trying to make their ways to different places around the world. There are also Jews that are trying to return home to their homes in Europe. There are some estimates that in the early aftermath of the war, there's about 1,500 Jews that try to go back to Berlin. There are a number of Jews who return to France or go to France anew. There's about 35,000 Jews that migrate to France by the late 1940s who had not been in France before. But the situation for them in a lot of these European places is not good. Because it was not good for anyone in Europe, because this was a global total war. There were housing shortages, there was political instability, economic crises. So they were trying to establish themselves back into places that were, had been destroyed in a number of ways. So the attempt to kind of reintegrate into European society was a difficult one. But I'm working on a new book that is specifically trying to answer this question: what happens to Jews who go back to France, and especially Yiddish speakers who go back to France, and what do they do? And a number of them, despite the difficulties in trying to reestablish their communities and their homes, sometimes having to fight in court to get their homes back, or maybe there's dressers or bureaus or possessions that have been stolen during the war, they are trying to reestablish their cultural ways of life, and then they're doing it relatively quickly. So there are attempts to kind of reinstitute some of these cultural practices. French-speaking Jews do the same. German-speaking Jews in Germany do the same as well. There are Jewish populations that remain in Europe. Hitler was not successful in eradicating Jewish life from Europe, and a lot of these attempts actually are, how can I say this politely, are a response to that, in kind of saying that, at least the figures that I am researching and writing about are very, very deliberate in the attempt to reestablish Jewish life in Europe is a response to Hitlerism, as the word that they use, is a response to Hitlerism. And so there's this kind of like this attempt to kind of recreate life there as in response to the genocide that had just happened. And it wasn't an easy task. Like I mentioned, it is a ruined landscape that they're trying to do this in. So there are a number of different paths that people take in trying to reestablish themselves. Some of these, if we're talking about Yiddish speakers, some of these Yiddish speakers try to maintain Yiddish. Some of them shed it. In North America, there's a number of Yiddish speakers who seek refuge here, and a number of them don't transmit Yiddish. They try to integrate or assimilate into maybe Canadian or U.S. societies and shed Yiddish to some extent. So there's a variety of ways, of course. I mean, this is the story of our conversation. There's a variety of ways that Jews kind of respond to their post-war moments, and some of it is to kind of maintain those cultures, and some of those are to integrate and maintain a Jewishness, but in a different way that maybe works in these new settings for them.
So, how would you describe the um, state of Jewish communities in 2023?
In the world?
Yeah, yeah. Start in the United States.
I mean, I think in the United States, there's a long Jewish history here, and I think that it's hard to talk about, kind of the American Jewish community, right? I mean, my own work on France, I talk about French Jewish communities, plural, because there's a number of them, and they're not always in agreement with each other. And it's probably that's probably true about in the United States as well, right? There are a number of Jewish communities, ethnic, religious, political, and I think a number of them are, advocating for themselves and kind of prominent in a number of places. The Hasidic community in and around the United States, mostly based in New York, is almost bringing Yiddish back because of their because of the growth of their families and how they maintain Yiddish in those communities. A very different Yiddish and different Yiddish cultural world than existed among secular Yiddish speakers in Eastern Europe, of course, but still, nonetheless, a challenge to kind of bring some of those elements back. We've had, the global, the American Jewish community remains, is integrated and successful in a number of ways. I mean, it's a difficult and challenging question to answer, and probably is the topic of a different conversation. Yeah. But I think is kind of emblematic of the Jewish history in the Americas here is that it's diverse and varied. I think integrated into the fabric of American society, probably in ways that most people don't recognize or realize. In a number of ways.
Absolutely. I think most Idahoans would be surprised to know how long there has been Jewish communities in Idaho.
Mm-hmm.
Here in Boise, where we're recording, we have had a Jewish community since the 1800s. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, we start to see a Jewish presence, established Jewish presence in Idaho from the work that I've read. In the mid-19th century, the mid-1800s, when Jews started to come out here, primarily in mining. And then there's a remarkable Jewish history to Idaho that I don't think most people realize. Boise has the longest, let me get this right, the longest continuously used synagogue west of the Mississippi. Which means that, so there was a synagogue that was established in the mid-1890s, 1895, or it was a community that was established in the mid-1890s, then shortly after that, a synagogue was constructed. I believe it was, I think it's built in 1895. That building, although it's no longer in its original space, that building is still used by the Jewish community in Boise, and it is, again, it is the longest running continuously used synagogue west of the Mississippi. There are older synagogues west of the Mississippi, but they're not used as synagogues anymore. And the building is on the National Register of Historic Places. It's a beautiful Moorish design, kind of late 19th century. It's a really beautiful building. But yes, and even more so, not just the synagogue, the historic synagogue here, but Idaho, for a good portion of the 20th century, supported two, and at least in Boise, two Jewish communities. There was the original kind of German Jewish community that followed the Reform movement, which is a German Jewish kind of development from the early 19th century, and then kind of exported to the Americas. And then shortly after that, about 40 years later, there's an Eastern European Orthodox community that is established in Idaho. And for a number of years, those two communities maintained their own synagogues. Over time, they blended and they kind of merged into the congregation that is now. But yes, there's a long and deep history. Idaho also is the first, Moses Alexander, who was one of the founders of Congregation Beth Israel, which is the first German Jewish community that I mentioned. He is first the mayor of Boise, and then in 1915 he is elected governor of the state of Idaho. And Idaho is the first state to have a practicing Jewish governor elected as governor. California had a governor who was voted earlier, but he was not a practicing Jew. So, if we want to split the historical hairs, there is one that we will split, and Idaho has the first, elects the first practicing Jew as governor, and during World War I.
That's a history to be proud of.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that it shows, it shows the kind of like the depth and the complexity of kind of the history of Idaho, and who has been a part of society here, and who is kind of being represented in the kind of in the upper echelons of Idaho society.
In Idaho, we are fortunate to have so much religious diversity and so many different congregations and religious groups that have settled here or originated here. Can you talk a little bit about why that is such a valuable legacy for Idahoans to be a place of religious diversity?
I think that any place that has a variety of people in it is valuable. I mean, maybe I'm biased because I'm a historian that studies, places that I don't live in and that I'm fascinated by, and I'm fascinated by different languages being spoken and the ways that people kind of structure their lives. So maybe it's just a byproduct of my profession that I think that these types of places are just enrich us all, because we can have different conversations, and if we embrace the kind of Jewish mode, maybe we can have arguments, but those arguments can be fruitful and kind of move somewhere. They don't have to be antagonistic or always antagonistic, right? I think that there's a way that societies can be built that have these various approaches to maybe religion or whatever it might be, and I think there's something to be valued there, because I think that we can only learn from that. I think that whenever we experience different cultures and different ways of thinking and just organizing ourselves in the lives and our lives and the ways that we think about each other, think about ourselves is important and valuable. When I teach at the College of Idaho, I teach an Introduction to Judaism class, and Rabbi Dan Fink has always invited the class to come for a Shabbat service on a Friday and have students experience that, because many of the students that take my classes, some of them do, but few of them, most of them do not have a Jewish background and don't have, so this is kind of an exposure to Judaism and Jewishness for them. And he invites them, and a number of them take him up on the offer, and they write about it, and they transformative experience it. A number of them think of it, right? That this is an experience and exposure to something that they've never seen before, and how much they value it. And really, I think is just exposing ourselves to these just kind of ways of life, I think are important, and I think only help kind of create a more interesting and constructive kind of society, right? I mean, maybe I'm biased, maybe I'm kind of laying a little into what I personally am interested in, but I don't know. I grew up in a kind of multicultural household, so I think to some extent I'm kind of influenced by that as well.
I agree, and I really appreciate your description of how valuable it is to have that diversity. I am a person of faith, and being curious about other faiths has only enriched and strengthened my experiences. And trying to understand the human experience, our religious views and faith are or not having them is such a part of our human experience. Yes. And it really helps us to appreciate and understand each other. And I really appreciate it. I hate to end on a sour note, but I do want to talk more about anti-Semitism. you would think that after the tragedy of the Holocaust, we wouldn't be seeing anti-Semitism anymore, but we are, and it has been on the rise in recent years. Why do these lies persist, do you think?
It's hard to... This is going to be speculative. It's hard to get into the mind of an anti-Semite. But I think that these... I think, I have a colleague who sometimes refers to anti-Semitism as Judeophobia. And I think that as long as there's fear of another, and in this case, fear of, for what we're talking about, Jews, and those fears that we know are based on kind of lies and misunderstandings and misconceptions, that I think that these ideas will persist. And I think that the reason that they do exist is because they're simple answers for people's ills. And I think that as long as there are societies, and I hope that I'm wrong about this, but I do think that if it's not Jews, it will be another minority culture that is targeted to explain why bad things are happening in the world, or whatever it might be, right? Maybe that's too glib and that's flippant. But I think that these ideas persist because there are still these unwarranted, unsubstantiated, unjustified fears of Jews in society, and this constant kind of thinking of them as other and not belonging, I think is based on that fear. And I think as long as those fears exist, then we will still have people kind of put forward the particular agendas that are kind of based on these anti-Semitic ideas. And I think now what we're seeing here, I think one of the changes that's happening is we're seeing, there's always been kind of grassroots level anti-Semitism historically, but we're starting to see kind of a shift away from this kind of top-down kind of governmentally sanctioned anti-Semitism to something that's kind of more into the fabric of various communities around the world. And I think that is something to be fearful of. And it is also something that we need to be constantly aware of when we're thinking about kind of the rise of anti-Semitism, that there is potentially something new about what's happening in the way that people are thinking about Jews. And kind of, as to your point, completely disregarding the historical record and a factual understanding of kind of Jewish history, Judaism, whatever it might be. And I think it's good to be to pay attention to that. Not sure if that satisfyingly answers your question.
Well, it was a terrible question, but I appreciate what you said in particular about fear. When we fear each other,
yes,
that can lead to hatred, to not understanding each other.
Yes.
So if we can be curious about each other and seek to understand each other, that can eliminate fear and misunderstanding. And I think you did your part today helping us to understand more about Jewish history and culture, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. It's been wonderful to talk with you, and again, I think that what the Idaho Humanities Council is doing is exactly this, right? I mean, there's something embedded in the humanities to have these conversations, to ask. I mean, your point is great, to ask questions and explore and be curious. I think that's kind of those are approaches to thinking about some of these topics, and I appreciate the invitation to talk with you about them, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk again.
Thank you, and I'll share more information about Dr. Underwood and his scholarship in the notes for this episode. Thank you.